The history of warfare is often dictated not merely by strategy or courage, but by the mechanical evolution of the tools placed in the hands of the common soldier. In January 1936, within the brick walls of the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, a quiet revolution occurred that would fundamentally alter the geometry of infantry combat. It was there that the United States Army officially standardized a rifle that would eventually become the envy of the world and the scourge of the Axis powers. This weapon was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic marvel designed to replace the bolt-action Springfield that had served since the turn of the century. The adoption of the M1 marked a definitive pivot point in military history, establishing the United States as the first nation to equip its standard infantry forces with a general-issue auto-loading rifle. However, this transition was not instantaneous, nor was it without its detractors. The road from the drawing board to the front lines was paved with skepticism, engineering hurdles, and bureaucratic intervention. Yet once the weapon reached the hands of American GIs in significant numbers, it provided a tactical advantage that was mathematically and psychologically overwhelming. To understand the magnitude of this shift, one must first look back to the limitations that plagued infantrymen during the First World War. In 1918, the American Expeditionary Force marched into Europe carrying the M1903 Springfield. By all accounts, the M1903 was a masterpiece of bolt-action engineering, accurate, reliable, and capable of hitting targets at great distances. However, the mechanism itself contained an inherent tactical flaw that no amount of training could fully overcome. After every single shot, the soldier was forced to physically grapple with his weapon. He had to lift the bolt handle, pull it rearward to eject the spent casing, push it forward to strip a new cartridge from the internal magazine, and lock it back down before he could fire again. This manual cycle required the shooter to break his sight picture and often shift his body position, disrupting his aim and situational awareness. A highly trained marksman might manage 10 to 15 aimed rounds per minute, but in the chaos of the trenches, against masked artillery and interlocking fields of machine gun fire, this rate was often insufficient. The Great War demonstrated with bloody clarity that sending men across open ground against entrenched defenders with bolt-action rifles was a recipe for slaughter. The infantry desperately needed a way to generate their own suppressing fire, a weapon that could allow a single soldier to deliver a volume of fire that could keep enemy heads down while his squad maneuvered. The concept of a semi-automatic weapon that utilized the energy of the fired round to cycle the action and cock the weapon for the next shot had been the fever dream of firearms designers for decades. The theoretical advantages were obvious. The shooter would simply need to pull the trigger for each discharge, maintaining his sight picture and firing position without interruption. However, turning this concept into a reality that was rugged enough for the mud of the trenches, light enough for a soldier to carry on a 20-mile march, and cheap enough to manufacture by the millions was an engineering puzzle that had stumped the world's greatest military minds. The man who finally cracked this code was not a West Point graduate or a formally trained engineer, but a French-Canadian immigrant named Jean-Cantius Garand. Born on New Year's Day in 1888 in Saint-Remy, Quebec, Garand was one of 12 children. His early life was defined by the hardscrabble reality of the era. His mother passed away when he was young, and his family immigrated to Connecticut in 1899 when John was just 11 years old. Instead of formal schooling, Garand received his education on the factory floor, sweeping up in a textile mill where he eventually began to tinker with the machines. It was there, amidst the clatter of looms and spindles, that he taught himself the machinist skills and intuitive grasp of metalwork that would define his legacy. Journey to the Springfield Armory was driven by a natural genius for mechanics and a relentless work ethic. He became a United States citizen in 1920, a year after he had already joined the engineering staff at the armory. For the next 17 years, his life was a cycle of design, testing, failure, and refinement. His dedication was absolute, bordering on obsessive. Early in the design process, Garand experimented with a primer-actuated blowback system, a complex method that relied on the movement of the primer in the cartridge case to initiate the cycling of the action. While these early prototypes functioned, they lacked the supreme reliability required for a standard-issue military arm. The breakthrough that would immortalize his name came when he pivoted to a gas-supported system, which he patented on April 12, 1930. This new design was a marvel of elegant efficiency. It worked by diverting a small portion of the expanding propellant gases through a port drilled into the barrel. These high-pressure gases drove a piston connected to an operating rod, which in turn rotated the bolt to unlock it, extracted the spent casing, and loaded a fresh round. It was a system that balanced power with precision, robust enough to handle the immense pressures of military ammunition yet refined enough to cycle smoothly without tearing the weapon apart. However, the existence of a working prototype did not guarantee adoption. The military procurement process is notoriously rigorous. and Garand found himself in a fierce competition with a rival designed by John Pedersen. The Pedersen rifle was a Tagalog semi-automatic that for a time seemed to be the first. Both designers had initially developed their rifles to fire a smaller 276 caliber cartridge, which offered lighter recoil and allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. In the competitive trials that ensued, the flaws of the Pedersen design began to show under the harsh scrutiny of military testing. The Pedersen required ammunition that was coated in a hard wax to function reliably, a logistical nightmare that Army officials knew would be impossible to maintain in the humid jungles of the Pacific or the muddy trenches of Europe. Furthermore, the Pedersen mechanism was more complex, possessing a higher part count and greater manufacturing costs. Crucially, when the Pedersen's action was held open, the breech was completely exposed, acting as a funnel for dirt, sand, and debris, the natural enemies of any firearm. In contrast, Garand's design was sealed and rugged. By January 1932, the board recommended the Garand for adoption, but there was one final, massive hurdle to clear: General Douglas MacArthur. At the time, MacArthur was the Army Chief of Staff, and he was looking at a military budget decimated by the Great Depression. The United States Army was sitting on massive stockpiles of .3006 ammunition left over from the First World War and subsequent production. MacArthur personally intervened, refusing to approve a change to a new caliber. He essentially told the Ordnance Department that if they wanted a new rifle, it had to fire the old ammunition. This directive forced Garand to return to the drawing board and redesign his entire system to handle the significantly more powerful .3006 Springfield cartridge. It was a testament to the strength of his gas-operated design that he was able to scale it up successfully. Finally, on January 9, 1936, the rifle was standardized as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1. The specifications of the final product were impressive, justifying the nearly 2 decades of development that had gone into it. The weapon was 43.6 inches long with a 24-inch barrel and weighed roughly 9.5 pounds. Unloaded, it fired a 150-grain bullet at a velocity of 2,800 feet per second, delivering a muzzle energy exceeding 2,600 foot-pounds. This power meant that the rifle had an effective range of 440 yards for the average soldier, with sharpshooters capable of reaching out much further. The defining characteristic of the M1 Garand, however, was not its range or its weight, but its rate of fire. A trained infantryman equipped with an M1 could deliver 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. It is crucial to understand that this was not a theoretical cycling speed achieved in a sterile laboratory, but a practical battlefield capability, because the semi-automatic operation absorbed a significant portion of the recoil and eliminated the need to manually work a bolt. Soldiers could keep their eyes on the target and their cheek welded to the stock between shots. This capability was critical for engaging moving targets, such as enemy infantry dashing between cover, and for delivering suppressive fire that kept enemy heads down. The M1 changed the rhythm of the firefight. It shifted the doctrine from relying heavily on conserved machine guns to empowering the individual rifleman to become a base of fire. The centerpiece of this system was the N-block clip, a sheet metal device that held 8 rounds of ammunition. The soldier would press the clip into the magazine from the top in one fluid motion. When the 8th and final round was fired, the clip was automatically ejected from the rifle with a distinctive metallic ping, and the bolt locked open, signaling instantly that the weapon was empty. A skilled soldier could reload in 2 to 3 seconds, maintaining a near-constant stream of lead down. When the manufacturing lines began to hum, the scale of production was a testament to American industrial might. In 1937, Springfield Armory was producing a mere 10 rifles per day. By January 1942, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that number had skyrocketed to 1,000 rifles a day. Peak production levels were reached in January 1944, when the armory alone was churning out nearly 4,000 rifles every single day. Winchester Repeating Arms Company was also brought on board to supplement production. By the time the assembly lines finally slowed, over 5.4 million M1 Garands had been manufactured. The cost of each unit, typically cited around $85 during the war, was irrelevant compared to the strategic value of arming millions of men with a superior weapon in record time. The distribution was not immediate, of course. When the Japanese struck the Philippines in December 1941, many American and Filipino troops were still carrying the older Some units were even skeptical of the new complicated weapon, with reports of scouts trading away their Garands for the familiar bolt-action rifles they trusted. But this hesitation was short. Combat experience is the ultimate arbiter of a weapon's value, and the M1 quickly proved its worth in blood. In the Pacific Theater, the M1 Garand became a legend. The nature of the fighting close-quarters jungle warfare, ambushes, and fanatical charges played directly to the strengths of a semi-automatic rifle. Japanese troops, armed primarily with Arisaka bolt-action rifles, were often stunned by the volume of fire a standard American squad could produce. On Guadalcanal, captured Japanese diaries revealed that enemy soldiers believed every American was equipped with a machine gun, The disparity in firepower was most evident during the terrifying banzai charges that characterized Japanese tactics. At Saipan in July 1944, the largest such attack of the war took place, with roughly 4,300 Japanese troops surging forward in a desperate, suicidal wave. Against a bolt-action-equipped force, such a mass of humanity might have overrun the lines simply by weight of numbers. Instead, they ran into a wall of fire generated by M1 Garands, supported by bars and machine guns. The ability of the American rifleman to fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, reload in seconds, and fire 8 more, meant that the human wave was cut down before it could make contact. Late in the war, Japanese commanders were forced to alter their tactics, avoiding mass charges precisely because the M1 Garand made them catastrophic for the attacker. The European theater offered a different set of challenges. From the salt spray of the Normandy beaches to the freezing forests of the Ardennes, on D-Day approximately 50 American soldiers stormed Omaha and Utah beaches carrying M1 South. Many of these weapons had been wrapped in pliafilm plastic bags to protect them from the salt water during the approach. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into the darkness of occupied France, with their rifles broken down in padded containers or strapped to their bodies. The conditions were brutal, yet the rifle performed. Veteran O.B. Hill, of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, recounted that his rifle had been soaked during the jump into Normandy, but functioned perfectly when he needed it. During the Battle of the Bulge, where temperatures plummeted and lubricants froze, the M1 continued to operate when other weapons failed. Hill noted that even when offered a choice of weaponry as a non-commissioned officer, he stuck with the M1 because it had carried him through the worst situations imaginable. The confidence the American soldier had in his rifle was absolute, a bond forged in the crucible of combat. The comparison between the M1 Garand and its German counterpart, the Kar 98K Mauser, highlights the technological gap that defined the infantry war in Europe. The Mauser was a fine hunting rifle, accurate and well-made, but it was a relic of a previous era. A German soldier could fire 5 rounds from his internal magazine, but after that, he had to fumble with stripper clips or load loose rounds individually, a process that took 8 to 10 seconds. In that same time, an American GI could fire 8 rounds, reload, and fire several more. German veterans on the receiving end often reported feeling suppressed by what they assumed was automatic weapons fire, only to realize they were facing standard riflemen. The German military hierarchy, initially dismissive of semi-automatic rifles as wasteful of ammunition and too complex for conscripts, eventually scrambled to catch up. They introduced the Guhar 43 G43 in late 1943, a semi-automatic rifle intended to counter the Garand. However, it was a case of too little, too late. Only about 400,000 G43s were produced, compared to the millions of Garands already in the field. Furthermore, the G43 was plagued by reliability issues and was generally considered inferior to the rugged American design. Many German soldiers were known to discard their own weapons in favor of captured M1 South when given the chance. The Japanese attempts to copy the Garand were even less successful. Recognizing the hopelessness of facing semi-automatic fire with bolt-action rifles, the Japanese military began development of the Type 4 rifle in 1944. It was essentially a modified to fire the Japanese 7.7mm cartridge. However, the industrial capacity of Japan had been shattered by strategic bombing and naval blockades. Only a handful of these rifles, estimates range from 125 to 250, were ever completed before the surrender, and many of those were never fully assembled. The Type 4 suffered from persistent jamming issues and never saw combat. It stands as a historical footnote, a symbol of the desperate attempt to match American engineering when the war was already lost. The M1 Garand stood alone, as the only standard-issue semi-automatic rifle to see mass deployment during the conflict, giving the Allies a distinct material advantage that translated directly into battlefield dominance. One specific aspect of the M1 Garand's operation has generated a persistent myth that requires addressing: the ping of the ejecting clip, a popular story, often repeated in movies and video games, suggests that German or Japanese soldiers would wait to hear the distinctive metallic sound of the clip ejecting to know that an American soldier was empty, using that moment of vulnerability to charge. While this makes for dramatic storytelling, historical evidence suggests it is largely fiction. A survey conducted in 1952 of over 300 Korean War veterans found that the vast majority preferred the ping, viewing it as a helpful audible signal that it was time to reload. Interviews with German veterans have consistently dismissed the idea as laughable. The reality of combat is deafeningly loud. The roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the crack of rifle fire would almost certainly drown out the relatively quiet sound of a small piece of sheet metal hitting the ground. Furthermore, combat is rarely a duel between two individuals. American soldiers fought in squads, meaning that even if one man was reloading, his teammates were covering him. The window of vulnerability during the 2-second reload was simply too small to be tactically exploited by an enemy hundreds of yards away. The service life of the M1 Garand extended well beyond the surrender of the Axis powers. It remained the primary battle rifle of the United States through the Korean War, where its reputation for reliability was further cemented in the harsh, freezing winters of the peninsula. Soldiers praised its ability to function in extreme cold that caused other weapons to seize up. It was not until 1957 that the M1 was officially replaced by the M14, a rifle that was, in essence, a product-improved Garand, with a detachable box magazine and select fire capability. The DNA of John Garand's design lived on in the M14 and, by extension, in the rifles used by designated marksmen and snipers for decades to come. Globally, the M1 was adopted by over 40 nations, serving in conflicts around the world long after it had retired from active U.S. service. Today, the civilian marksmanship program continues to sell surplus M1 Garands to qualified American citizens, ensuring that these pieces of history are preserved and appreciated by new generations of shooters and collectors. Ultimately, the story of the M1 Garand is the story of American ingenuity and industrial capability, coalescing at exactly the right moment in history. General George S. Patton, a man not known for hyperbole when it came to weapons of war, famously wrote in January 1945 that the M1 rifle was the greatest battle implement ever devised. This was not merely praise for a piece of machinery, it was a recognition of what the rifle represented. It was a tool that transformed the average conscript into a formidable warrior. It was a weapon that functioned when it was covered in mud, frozen in ice, or rusted by salt spray. It gave the American squad the ability to win the firefight through superior volume of fire, saving countless lives by suppressing the enemy and allowing for maneuver. John Garand, the humble immigrant who made it all possible, never received royalties for his invention. He maintained that he was an employee of the government and that the rifle belonged to the nation. He retired from the Springfield Armory in 1953, having served his adopted country for 34 years. When asked about his lack of financial compensation, he reportedly expressed simply that he was happy to have served. His reward was not in dollars, but in the knowledge that he had armed millions of young Americans with the finest infantry rifle of its era, a weapon that not only won a war but defined a generation.